Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying the content. As a college student, I work hard to create these videos, and I edit everything on my mobile phone. I'm hoping to upgrade to a laptop to improve the quality of my videos, but I don't want to ask for money directly. This Christmas, if you enjoy what I do, I'd be incredibly grateful if you could consider subscribing to the channel. It would mean the world to me. Your support helps me so much as I continue working toward my goals. Wishing you all a very Merry Christmas. May this festive season bring you joy and warmth. Thanks again for your support, and stay tuned for more.
It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a chance to escape the monotony of daily life. My friends had raved about the remote cabin up in the mountains, a place surrounded by nature and cut off from the chaos of the world. I wasn't much for seclusion, but they assured me the isolation would be worth it. The idea of crackling fireplaces, snow-covered trees, and endless hot chocolate was too tempting to resist. We had planned to leave early, but delays piled up. By the time we hit the mountain road, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. Thick clouds loomed overhead, and the first flurries of snow began to dance in the air. The cabin was only a few miles away, but the snowfall intensified rapidly. It was a whiteout within minutes, the world outside our car swallowed by swirling flakes. "We'll be fine," Sam, my best friend, said from the driver's seat. His voice carried a confidence I didn't share. "The cabin's got a generator, plenty of supplies. We'll be snowed in, sure, but that's the point, right?" I nodded, though my unease didn't fade. The road twisted and turned, the car's tires struggling for traction on the slick surface. We passed no other vehicles, no signs of life. Just the endless expanse of snow and the skeletal outlines of trees. When we finally reached the cabin, relief washed over me. It was exactly as described, rustic but cozy, with smoke curling lazily from the chimney. We hurried inside, stomping the snow from our boots and shaking off the cold. The cabin's warmth enveloped us immediately, the fireplace already crackling. "Told you it'd be worth it," Sam said with a grin, handing me a mug of hot chocolate. The others arrived shortly after, their laughter filling the cabin as we settled in. There were 6 of us in total: me, Sam, his girlfriend Liz, her brother Mark, and a couple I barely knew, Anna and Derek. We spent the evening playing board games, telling stories, and drinking. The storm raged outside, but inside, we were safe and content. It wasn't until the second night that things began to unravel. The snowstorm had worsened, burying the cabin under feet of snow. We were completely cut off. The generator sputtered but held on, and we rationed our food carefully, knowing we might be stuck for days. Still, spirits were high, until Mark went outside. He'd stepped out to check on something, though I couldn't recall what. When he didn't come back after 10 minutes, Liz started to worry. Sam grabbed a flashlight and went to look for him. I followed, though I wasn't eager to brave the storm. The snow swallowed our boots as we trudged into the night, calling Mark's name. The cold bit at my skin, and the wind howled like a living thing. We found him near the woods, standing completely still. The flashlight beam caught his face, and I'll never forget the look in his eyes, wide, unblinking, filled with terror. He didn't speak, even when Sam shook him. It was as if he'd been turned to stone. We dragged him back to the cabin, where Liz wrapped him in blankets and tried to coax him to talk. But Mark just stared into space, shivering uncontrollably. It wasn't until hours later, when he finally spoke, that the true horror began. "There's someone out there," he whispered. We pressed him for details, but he only repeated the same phrase. "Someone's watching." The mood in the cabin shifted instantly. What had been a cozy retreat now felt oppressive, every shadow a potential threat. Sam and Derek checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. The snowstorm made it impossible to leave, and the thought of someone lurking outside filled me with dread. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind set my nerves on edge. At some point, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off, only to wake to a blood-curdling scream. I shot out of bed, heart pounding. The scream had come from the living room. Grabbing a flashlight, I ran down the hall, nearly colliding with Liz. The others were already there, standing in stunned silence. The front door was wide open, snow blowing in. Anna was gone. We searched the cabin and the immediate area, but there was no sign of her. The tracks in the snow were already disappearing, swallowed by the relentless storm. Panic set in. Derek was inconsolable, blaming himself for not waking up. Sam tried to keep us calm, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "We'll wait until morning," he said. "The storm has to let up eventually. We'll find her." But morning brought no relief. The snow continued to fall, and Anna was still missing. We debated our options, but there was little we could do. The nearest town was miles away, and we had no way to call for help. That afternoon, I found something that made my blood run cold. Behind the cabin, buried in the snow, was a set of footprints. They weren't Anna's, these were large, made by boots. They led from the woods to the cabin and back again. Someone had been here. I showed the others, and the fear in their eyes mirrored my own. We were being watched. Sam suggested we stay together, keep the fire going, and wait for the storm to pass. It was the only plan that made sense, but it did little to calm my nerves. The next night, we barricaded the doors and windows as best we could. Mark sat in a corner, muttering to himself. Derek barely spoke. Liz clung to Sam, her face pale. I kept the knife from the kitchen close at hand, though I doubted it would do much good. At some point during the night, I heard it, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps on the roof. I froze, straining to listen. The sound moved slowly, deliberately. Someone was up there, walking across the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest as I nudged Sam awake. He listened for a moment, then motioned for the others to stay quiet. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, all was silent. Then came a loud thud, as if something heavy had been dropped. We waited breathless, but the sound didn't come again. When dawn broke, we found nothing out of place, but the tension was unbearable. Over the next 2 days, our supplies dwindled. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Mark's condition worsened. He barely ate or drank, his eyes sunken and hollow. Derek suggested making a run for it, but the idea was quickly dismissed. Whoever was out there would surely have the advantage in the snow. Then, on the 5th night, it happened. Sam had taken the first watch while the rest of us tried to sleep. I was dozing fitfully when I heard a crash. I bolted upright, grabbing the knife, and ran to the living room. The front door had been forced open. Snow blew inside, and Sam was gone. We searched frantically, calling his name, but he was nowhere to be found. Liz was hysterical, and Derek's fear turned to anger. "We can't just sit here and wait to die," he shouted. "We need to do something." But what could we do? The storm, the isolation, the footprints in the snow, everything felt like a trap. Whoever was out there knew the terrain. They were toying with us, picking us off one by one. That night, I barely slept. Liz stayed by the fire, clutching a picture of Sam. Derek paced the cabin, muttering to himself. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sound of the back door creaking open. I grabbed the knife and crept toward the sound. My breath caught in my throat as I saw a figure silhouetted against the snow. It was a man, dressed in heavy winter gear, his face obscured by a hood. He held something in his hand, a length of rope. Before I could react, he turned and disappeared into the storm. I woke the others, and we bolted the door, but the damage was done. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't random. He was hunting us. The next morning, Liz was gone. Her footprints led into the woods, but they ended abruptly, as if she'd been lifted off the ground. Derek and I were the only ones left. We barricaded ourselves in the cabin, armed with whatever we could find. The tension was suffocating. Every sound, every shadow felt like a threat. On the 7th night, he came for us. The doors and windows rattled as if struck by a battering ram. Derek screamed, swinging a fire poker wildly, but it was no use. The man broke through, moving with terrifying precision. I fought back, slashing with the knife, but he was too strong. Derek fell first, his screams cut short. I managed to wound the man, cutting across his arm, but he barely flinched. Desperation took over, and I ran. Out into the storm, the snow blinding and cold. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. I stumbled through the snow for what felt like hours, the wind roaring in my ears. When I finally collapsed, exhausted and freezing, I thought it was the end. But then, lights appeared through the storm. Headlights. A search party found me, half frozen and delirious. I babbled about the man, the footprints, the others. They took me to a hospital, where I learned the storm had finally passed. The authorities investigated the cabin. They found the bodies of my friends, but no sign of the man. The footprints were gone, erased by the snow. For weeks, I was questioned, my story met with skepticism. No one could explain what had happened, and eventually, the case was closed. To this day, I don't know who he was or why he targeted us. But every winter, when the snow begins to fall, I hear the footsteps in my dreams. The snowstorm was unlike anything I'd ever seen, a relentless wall of white that erased the world around me. I had been on my way to a remote research outpost, tasked with delivering critical equipment before the storm hit. The forecast had warned of heavy snowfall, but this was a monster. I had taken a government-issued snowcat, a bulky and slow vehicle, but one that could handle rough terrain and deep snow. The journey was supposed to take only a few hours, but as the storm intensified, my progress slowed to a crawl. The headlights barely penetrated the swirling snow, and the GPS kept losing signal. I was completely alone, surrounded by a vast, unbroken expanse of white. The outpost was a small facility used by a team of climatologists studying extreme weather patterns. It was located high in the mountains, far from any town or city. I'd been there once before during the summer, when the landscape was lush and green. Now, it felt like an alien planet, cold and hostile. The first sign that something was wrong came when I tried to radio the outpost. There was no response, just static. I tried several times, switching frequencies and adjusting the settings, but it was no use. The storm was likely interfering with the signal, I told myself, though unease began to creep in. I pressed on, the snowcat's treads crunching through the snow. Hours passed, the storm showing no signs of letting up. The wind howled like a living thing, shaking the vehicle and making it difficult to stay on course. I checked the GPS again, but it was still useless. My only option was to rely on the landmarks I remembered from my previous visit. As night fell, the storm grew even fiercer. I could barely see a few feet ahead, and the cold seeped into the snowcat despite the heater running at full blast. My hands trembled, not just from the cold but from the growing sense of isolation. I hadn't seen any signs of life for hours, no animals, no tracks, nothing. And then, out of the darkness, a shape emerged. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the headlights against the swirling snow. But as I drew closer, I realized it was a building. Relief flooded through me. I'd reached the outpost. Or so I thought. The building was larger than I remembered, a hulking structure with dark, snow-covered walls. The windows were frosted over, and no light shone from within. Something about it felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on it. I parked the snowcat near the entrance and stepped out into the storm, pulling my hood tight against the wind. The cold was like a physical force, stabbing through my layers of clothing. I trudged to the door, my boots sinking into the snow. When I reached it, I found it slightly ajar, the lock broken. My unease deepened. This wasn't right. The outpost was supposed to be secure. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, shaking off the snow. The interior was dimly lit by emergency lights, casting long, eerie shadows. The air was frigid, colder than it should have been. I called out, my voice echoing through the empty halls. "Hello? Is anyone here?" No response. I moved deeper into the building, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The walls were lined with equipment and research materials, some of it toppled over as if in a hurry. Papers were scattered across the floor, and the faint smell of ozone lingered in the air. Something had happened here. I reached the main control room, where the team should have been monitoring the storm. The room was empty, the chairs overturned. Monitors flickered with static, and the main console was covered in frost. I checked the logs, but they were corrupted, the data unreadable. It was as if the storm had wiped everything clean. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from down the hall. I froze, my heart pounding. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate. It wasn't the wind or the building settling. Someone, or something, was here. I grabbed a flashlight from my pack and moved toward the sound, my breath visible in the cold air. The hallway stretched on, lined with doors leading to storage rooms and laboratories. The tapping grew louder as I approached, until I reached a door at the end of the hall. It was slightly open, a sliver of light spilling out. I pushed it open with trembling hands, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The room was empty, except for a single chair in the center. On it sat a recorder, its tape spinning. The tapping sound was coming from the recorder, a steady beat like a metronome. I approached cautiously, reaching out to stop the tape. Before I could touch it, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my flashlight illuminating nothing but the empty room. My pulse raced as I tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. The tapping on the recorder stopped, replaced by static. Then, a voice crackled through the speaker. "You shouldn't be here." I backed away, my mind racing. The voice was distorted, mechanical, but there was something unnervingly human about it. I searched the room for another exit, but there was none. Panic set in as I pounded on the door, shouting for help. The voice came again, louder this time. "You need to leave. Now." The lights flickered, and the air grew colder. I could see my breath in front of me, each exhale a cloud of fear. Then, the recorder stopped, and the room was plunged into silence. The door creaked open on its own. I didn't wait to question it. I bolted down the hall, back toward the snowcat. The storm outside was still raging, but I didn't care. I needed to get out of there. As I reached the exit, I glanced back and saw a figure standing at the end of the hall. Tall, motionless, and watching me. I ran into the storm, the snow blinding me. The snowcat was where I'd left it, and I climbed inside, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I slammed it into gear, speeding away from the building. My hands trembled on the wheel, my mind racing with questions. What had happened at the outpost? Where was the research team? And who, or what, was that figure? As the snowcat plowed through the drifts, the storm seemed to close in around me. The headlights illuminated the snow, but beyond that, there was nothing. Just an endless, suffocating white. I drove for hours, trying to find my way back to civilization. The GPS was still useless, and the landmarks I'd relied on were buried under the snow. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and my fuel gauge was dropping fast. Then, in the distance, I saw lights. At first, I thought I was imagining it, a trick of the storm. But as I drew closer, the lights grew brighter. It was a building, smaller than the outpost but still substantial. Relief washed over me as I realized it might be another station. I parked the snowcat and approached cautiously, the wind howling around me. The building was dark, its windows frosted over. I knocked on the door, shouting to be heard over the storm. No answer. I tried the door, and it creaked open. Stepping inside, I felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. The layout was identical to the outpost I just fled, down to the scattered papers and frost-covered consoles. And in the center of the control room was a recorder, its tapes spinning. I didn't wait for the voice to start. I turned and ran back to the snowcat, my mind screaming that something was wrong. The storm seemed to laugh around me, the wind mocking my fear. I climbed into the vehicle and started the engine, but it sputtered and died. The fuel was gone. Panic set in as I realized I was stranded. The storm was too intense to travel on foot, and the building behind me felt like a trap. I grabbed my emergency supplies and huddled in the snowcat, praying for the storm to end. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time lost all meaning in the endless white. The cold seeped into my bones, and I drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time I woke, I heard it, the faint tapping of a recorder, somewhere in the distance. When the storm finally broke, I was found by a rescue team. They said I'd been missing for 3 days, though it felt like much longer. I tried to explain what had happened, but my story was met with skepticism. The outpost was abandoned, they said, and had been for years. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I hear it again, the steady tapping of a recorder, calling me back to the storm. The snowstorm descended without warning, transforming the world into a swirling void of white. I was on assignment to deliver supplies to a remote mountain lodge, a place so isolated that it wasn't even marked on most maps. It was supposed to be a simple task, a 3-hour drive up a winding road to drop off provisions and check on the caretaker, a man named Elliot who was known for his reclusive nature. But as the storm began to rage, I realized this was no ordinary blizzard. The journey started uneventfully. The morning air had been crisp, the road dusted with a light layer of snow. By the time I reached the base of the mountain, the wind had picked up, and the snow was falling heavily. My truck, equipped with chains and loaded with supplies, handled the conditions well enough at first. But as I climbed higher, the storm grew fiercer. Visibility dropped to mere feet, the world outside my windshield becoming a chaotic blur of white. I kept the radio on for updates, but the static soon drowned out any coherent broadcasts. My phone had no signal, and the GPS flickered uselessly. The only guide I had was the memory of the route, and the occasional snow-covered marker. It felt like I was driving into the void, the storm swallowing everything behind me. After hours of slow progress, I spotted a faint glow through the storm. Relief washed over me as I recognized the lodge. It was a 2-story wooden structure, its windows dark but the porch light still on, casting a dim halo in the snow. I parked the truck and stepped out, the wind biting through my layers of clothing. Grabbing the first crate of supplies, I trudged toward the door, my boots sinking into the deepening snow. The lodge was eerily silent. I knocked, but there was no answer. After a moment, I tried the door and found it unlocked. Pushing it open, I called out, "Elliot? It's Jonah, here with your supplies." My voice echoed in the empty space. The interior was dimly lit by a single lantern on the front desk. The air was cold, far colder than it should have been with the storm raging outside. I set the crate down and ventured further inside, the floorboards creaking under my boots. The main room was deserted, the furniture covered in a thin layer of dust. Something felt off. The lodge wasn't abandoned, but it looked as though it hadn't been touched in weeks. I found no sign of Elliot on the ground floor. The kitchen was tidy but unused, the fireplace cold and empty. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, where the caretaker's quarters were located. The door to his room was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, a chill ran down my spine. The room was in disarray. The bed was unmade, and clothes were strewn across the floor. A half-eaten meal sat on the desk, now moldy and unrecognizable. But what caught my attention was the writing on the walls. Scrawled in black marker, the words were frantic, overlapping, and illegible in some places. One phrase stood out, repeated over and over. "It's watching." A noise from downstairs snapped me out of my stupor. It was faint, almost drowned out by the wind, a soft creak, like a floorboard under weight. Heart pounding, I descended the stairs, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing the same empty space I had left moments ago. But something was different. The front door, which I had left slightly ajar, was now closed. I called out again, my voice trembling. "Elliot? Is that you?" No response. I checked the door. It was locked from the inside. A sense of unease settled over me as I realized I wasn't alone. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming before stabilizing. I cursed under my breath, gripping it tightly as I moved through the lodge, checking each room. Everything was as I had left it, silent and still. Then I heard it, a faint tapping sound, coming from the back of the lodge. It was rhythmic, deliberate. I followed the sound to a storage room, the door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, I found nothing but shelves of supplies and a single window, frosted over and rattling in the wind. The tapping had stopped. Suddenly, the power went out. The lantern on the front desk extinguished, plunging the lodge into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam now my only source of light. The wind howled outside, and the building seemed to groan under its weight. My breath was visible in the freezing air, each exhale a cloud of fear. I decided to leave. Supplies or not, something was wrong, and I wasn't equipped to deal with it. As I moved toward the front door, I noticed something on the floor that hadn't been there before, footprints in the thin layer of snow that had blown in through the cracks. They weren't mine. The prints led away from the door, deeper into the lodge. I followed them, my heart pounding. The prints wound through the main room and down a hall I hadn't explored yet. At the end of the hall was another door, slightly ajar. As I approached, the tapping sound returned, louder this time. It was coming from inside. Pushing the door open, I found a small office. A desk sat in the center, papers scattered across its surface. A recorder lay on its side, its tape spinning but producing no sound. The tapping stopped as soon as I entered. The room was empty, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. Then, the recorder crackled to life. A voice, distorted and barely audible, whispered through the static. "You shouldn't be here." I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The voice repeated, louder this time. "You need to leave." I didn't wait to hear it a third time. Grabbing the flashlight, I bolted out of the room and back toward the main hall. The footprints were gone, erased as if they had never been there. The storm outside was deafening, the wind rattling the windows and doors. I reached the front door and yanked it open, stepping out into the blizzard. The cold hit me like a physical blow, but I didn't care. I needed to get to the truck and get out of there. The snow was knee-deep, and the wind made it almost impossible to see. I stumbled toward the faint outline of the vehicle, my breath coming in ragged gasps. As I reached the truck, I saw them, more footprints, circling the vehicle. They led off into the storm, disappearing into the white void. My hands shook as I fumbled with the door, climbing inside and locking it behind me. The engine roared to life, and I turned the truck around, heading back down the mountain as fast as the conditions would allow. The storm seemed to fight me at every turn, the wind howling and the snow blinding. My heart raced as I navigated the treacherous road, the lodge disappearing behind me. But the sense of being followed didn't fade. Every so often, I thought I saw movement in the rearview mirror, a shadowy figure just beyond the edge of the taillights. It took hours to reach the base of the mountain, and by the time I did, the storm had begun to subside. I pulled into a ranger station, stumbling inside to report what had happened. The rangers listened, their expressions growing graver as I recounted the events. "The lodge has been closed for years," one of them said. "Elliot left last winter. We haven't sent anyone up there since." My blood ran cold. "That's impossible. Someone was there. I saw the footprints." They exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing more. I stayed at the station until the storm passed, but the sense of unease never left me. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone on that mountain. And sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I hear it again, the faint, rhythmic tapping, calling me back to the lodge.